Are you? We've been praying for this for a long time.
Yeah.
Oh, here, and then we'll do this.
Now this study is for, and I've tried to hand out. If those on the website, if they can go to the home page, they can click on a document about what I did, kind of wrote up about the source of laws and effects. It's only 4 pages long, but it's thick. What I mean is you have to read it carefully. So I'm going to try to present this. It's about the law, which kind of tends to get thick because of the use of language. But it's important. It's part of formation for you to understand the source of law. Could you turn down just when you get back?
Yeah.
That.
Turn down?
Yeah, turn it down until we're going to take questions. I don't want to hear comments. Okay, so the order of what we'll do is I'm going to kind of read I put together a little talk, and I don't want to be very boring, so I'm going to try very hard not to be. So reserve questions. I would invite you, though, to take a pen and write down stuff as things come to your mind, because this is somewhat formulaic in a way, in one sense that you walk through the forms of law. And so reserving questions till the end will make it more dynamic. And give us the time to get through it. I did give this presentation in a different form here, actually in this room, for the OCIA about, 2 months ago or something like that. Earlier in May, which is now becoming almost 2 months. I want to begin with the old question is, where does law come from? And why should we obey it? And where does law come from, ultimately? Yeah, it comes from God, all origin, And this is a study about Thomas Aquinas' questions 90 at Sec on the origins of law, on the nature of law. So this is going to correspond to it. So we hear a great deal today about law, constitutional law, natural law, civil rights, and the moral law. And the law even that is in our own bones and body and our soul. But the man who gave Western civilization as the most systematic and enduring answer to these questions was a Dominican friar, and that's St. Thomas Aquinas. And his name is known throughout the church as the angelic doctor. Today we're going to walk through Thomas's account as he lays it out in the Summa Theologica, first part of the second part, which abbreviates, and of course, questions 90 through 92. And what I want to do is cover it in its essence, in its beginning, and at the different kinds that it's related to. We start with, and the other goal is that do it in such a way that it creates a mental map that makes sense of the law, not just as a human invention, but that is something woven into the very fabric of the reality of God himself. That's important to understand. The essence of law, it comes, lex is the Latin word for law. We've often heard lex, rex. Anybody know what that means?
King's law?
Lex, the law of the king. Yeah. So lex, rex is the saying that goes way back. Thomas opens with a definition that's worth memorizing. And he says that is a rule and measure of acts whereby man is induced to act or is restrained from acting. Simple, profound. The Latin word for law is rex, is lex. You've seen it in words like in the legislature. Legal, legitimate. Lex comes from ligare, to bind. But what is it, and by what authority does it come to us? Thomas' answer is, law binds us by reason toward the common good, not by the mere will of the powerful, not by custom alone, but by reason. Our intellect is ordered toward the truth. Law extends that ordering into our shared life together. He draws 3 important conclusions. First, because the last end of human life is happiness, real happiness, the beatitude that Christ promises. Where else do we see in law about the pursuit of happiness. It's no accident where these come together in our own founding documents. Law must be ordered toward that end, beginning with the common good of the community. We don't have our own law. It's not subjective. Today, I'm against killing. Tomorrow, I can kill my kid in the womb. That's what we're living with. Subjective law versus objective. And God gave us objective law. He draws, and he says, lawmaking therefore belongs to the whole people. Where else do we get that concept in the American founding? The consent of the governed. The law comes through the consent of the governed. And it's an institution entrusted with the care. In other words, all people together. This predates what they said in the Constitution by 3,000 years. The people ultimately are the ones responsible. But we delegate to those above us, in some sense of that word, the power to make law. For us in this country, that's the Congress, the state legislatures, and ultimately even the church in its own domain. Second, the law that is not ordered to the common good, but to the private advantage of the lawmaker is not, properly speaking, a law at all. It is an act of violence dressed in legal clothing. That's the very term that Thomas uses. St. Thomas talks about law that is not law. True law is violence, is a form of violence, is the term he used. For a law to bind, it must be promulgated. That means notice given to the entire country or nation, and it has to be publicly known. That's the only way a judge can say ignorance of the law is not an excuse. An unpublished law is, in fact, a contradiction in terms, because it is no law. Thomas identifies 5 kinds of law, and they're not simply a list. They form a hierarchy, a ladder, a highest source to the human heart. Let's take them in order. See if I can figure this thing out. There's the next one, the natural law, the kinds of law, eternal law. At the summit of Thomas's hierarchy is the eternal law. And the eternal law, obviously, is what God has created in eternity and is nothing less than God's own reason, his wisdom, the governing acts and movements of every creature in the universe. Because God is not the subject to time, he simply is. His governance is eternal. The eternal law is its course, is God's will for all creation. Why is it eternal? Because it lasts forever. Now, here is what is important for everything that follows. All other laws, every human statute, moral norm, every instinct of conscience, derive their binding force from the eternal law. They participate in it imperfectly, but nevertheless in a way that it participates like a candle participates in the light of the sun. The eternal law is an unchangeable truth that's behind all truth. Can we know it fully? No, not in this life. We can know it partially through reason, just as sure as that we can know God through reason. But we do so through Scripture and through the church. But the partial knowledge we have is real and binding, and it is sufficient to guide us. Now the next is called the natural law, and I added physics here, and there's a little bit of argument in philosophy and elsewhere whether the physical laws are part of the natural law. I consider it does. And the second law, kind of law, is the natural law, and there's where the eternal law touches us directly. Thomas defines it as the rational creature's participation in God's law or eternal law. Okay, makes sense? In plain terms, God has written his law into human nature itself. St. Paul points this in the book of Romans. He notes that even the Gentiles, people who had never received the law of Moses, this is Romans 2, if you're familiar with that, sometimes did this by nature what the law required because the law was written in their hearts. He says in Romans 2, when Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, where their conscience also bears witness. That is why we see good men, even who are atheists, believe it or not, because they obey the law of the conscience in them. The function of natural law, Thomas says, is to help each person discern good from evil. It is the moral compass built into every human being by virtue of simply being a human. Now, is the natural law the same as the Ten Commandments? Not exactly, but there is a profound connection. The Ten Commandments can be understood as a written, authoritative statement of what the law, natural law, already requires of every person. Okay? God gave them to Moses because sin had clouded human reason, and the written word was needed to make explicit what nature had already inscribed. Let's see here. More on natural law. Under the new covenant, something even more remarkable happens. Jeremiah had prophesied it. God promises to write his law not on the stone but on the heart. Ezekiel adds, and I remember reading this when I was quite young, reading the book of Ezekiel because I was venturing into the scripture. And he says, God will put his own, I think it's in Ezekiel 36, his own spirit within us, enable us to walk in his statutes. So not only did it bind, the Ten Commandments created and binds our conscience, but now he says, I'm going to enable you to obey the law. And Paul, writing in Corinthians, says that the new law is written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, you could change that to say hearts of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. He did say it. The same Spirit also raised Jesus from the dead, now lives in believers, empowering holy living. This is not moral instruction simply. It is a transformation. One important note. St. Thomas says on natural law, it cannot be entirely destroyed. Even in the worst of sinners, some trace of moral sins remains. But it can be severely obscured, blotted out in particular areas by concupiscence, habit, and sin. This is why we need more than the natural law alone. The third one that to keep in mind we'd identify as human law. The law made by human beings for the governance of communities. This is not the law most of us think of when we hear the word constitutions, statutes, regulations, court decisions. Thomas is clear that human law derives its legitimacy from natural law, through natural law from the eternal law. A human law has the law of nature, a human law has the nature of law, he says, only insofar as it partakes in human right reason. As soon as it goes around that, it is no longer law. Where it deviates from reason, it is no longer law, as he says, it is violence. Where a tyrant makes law that is contrary to reason and the common good, that is not law absolutely speaking, but a perversion of the law. Now, Thomas identifies two ways a law can be unjust. First, it can be contrary to human good. Perhaps it is arbitrary, or it places an unreasonable burden on the people, or the lawmaker exceeds his authority, or the law is made for the private advantage of or vainglory of the powerful. Now, we see this when we hear about, of course, the legislature can change the course of the sun. We know that's ridiculous. It's patently ridiculous, if not insane. But there are those who have tried to do it in other areas as well. Killing little kids in the womb is an example. It is as insane to try to change the course of the sun. The only thing it's not within our right, but it's within our power to kill. And we don't have the power to change the course of the sun. That's the only distinction. Here's where I want to pause and bring a voice that many of you will recognize. In 1963, from a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, excuse for that. Serious excuse.
Yeah.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we all have becoming very aware of his
shortcomings,
concupiscence, shortcomings, and what man does not, or woman. Dr. Martin Luther King wrote one of the most important political letters in American history, and in it we appeal directly to St. Thomas Aquinas. I admonish each of you, not admonish, but urge you to read it. because it does say in the sum and substance of the civil rights movement, a legitimate and powerful summation of the civil rights movement and why it was important. There are all kinds of mistakes surrounding it and swirling around it, but this one is one expression of some really bright documentation. He quote, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal or natural law." Close quote. He goes on in that document to explain that one of the things that is not a just law is segregation, and he articulates it very well. The forced separation of peoples. And hold on to your question till the end, Phil, okay? Aquinas, writing in 13th century Italy, he's writing in 13th century, King writing in 20th century Alabama. The same framework, this is not a coincidence, is the enduring power of tradition that tells the truth about law. Now, what happens when we face a manifestly unjust human law? Consider the hierarchy here. Consider the off-putting of an unjust law. Thomas is nuanced here. Even an unjust law retains the appearance of law, because all authority ultimately comes from God. In the book of Romans, in chapter 13, I urge you to read the first 7, 8 verses of chapter 13. It's very clear our duty to obey the law. And he counsels us to respect governing authorities, that is St. Paul. But the apostles themselves gave us the overriding principle in Acts 5. We must obey God rather than men. When human law commands what God forbids, or forbids what God commands, our obligation is clear. Thomas adds a practical note from the scope of human law. Because human beings are not perfectly virtuous, human law cannot forbid every vice or mandate every virtue. It would be unenforceable and tyrannical. Human law targets those behaviors that bear most directly in the common good and leaves the rest to conscience, custom, and grace. Anybody give me an example of what might be what we see there? Is where local government doesn't try to regulate everything, every virtue or lack thereof or vice?
Yeah, he's been writing.
A good example might be where the local government doesn't wipe out the red light district, the whores, or the other sexual sins. It's just simply there, and as long as it's confined to a given area or point, then it's tolerable. And it also gets back to his discussion with regard to tolerance. What is civil tolerance and what is social tolerance? That's not our study here today, but Thomas does get into it, and I urge you to study the distinction. That, in other words, tolerance has a place, but not a right. The fourth kind of law is divine. See if my sequence here is correct. The divine law, there it is. The fourth kind of law is the divine law. God that himself was revealed directly because reason and natural law are not sufficient to bring us to our final end. Thomas gives 3 reasons why we need a divine law beyond natural reason. First, human judgment is uncertain, especially in particular in contingent matters. Different people from different judgments and contrary laws result. We need a law that has no error. Second, human law can only govern outward acts. We cannot see it in the heart. What is the modern version that's contrary to this? And we see this in some criminal law. It's an upgrade of a violation. We're governing the hearts of another when we call it a hate crime. All law criminal law is based upon hate of another. This gets to be a little bit ridiculous. I don't want to get political here, but there's an incircular reasoning that feeds itself, which is not true. It's illogical. So
when is murder not a hate crime?
Right. Thank you.
Exactly.
First, human judgment is uncertain. Oh, I said that. Human law can only govern outward acts. It cannot see it into the heart. But virtue requires integrity of both exterior conduct and interior intention. Virtue. At its core, what is virtue? Anyone define that?
Disposition to do the good.
It's a disposition to do the good, but but you're leaving one element out of it. You have the disposition, but you always do the good. You follow through. It's actually a habit that is now ingrained us to do that disposition. We're fully disposed to do the good. So good habit, whenever you see somebody who's going to the church to Mass every Sunday, even though they have a bad attitude about it, let's say they're 17 and they have a bad attitude, don't discourage them. Don't criticize them, because the habit of doing so will turn into a virtue. They will eventually accept the reality of who they are. It's the same thing that Christ says, raise them in what they should do and they will return to it. Rule them with a rod and they'll come back to it. No, why is it? Because they don't understand it. But the habit turns into that disposition, the law says, which turns into a virtue. So we have to be really careful in our criticism, especially of children. And that's an example of that. Our end is not merely earthly happiness. It is eternal happiness. It's one of the reasons for this divine law. We engage in the beatific vision. We need direction toward an end that goes beyond what unaided reason can chart. In other words, we need divine law to understand reason more fully. Thomas divides the divine law in two. The old law, the Ten Commandments, was directly primary life on this earth, and it motivated obedience chiefly through fear of punishment. It was good, holy, and from God, but ultimately preparatory. The new, not dissimilar to the idea of being spiritually rich in the Old Testament, is having lots of lambs and land and riches. In the New Testament, the richness, the spiritual richness, is in what's in our heart and directly related to God. The new law, the law of Christ, is a law of love. It directs human acts according to the order of righteousness and motivates not by fear but by charity, which is, as Paul says, poured into our hearts by the grace of Christ. The new law fulfills and perfects the old. It is not an abandonment of the commandments, but their internalization, the law of God and the love of neighbor, from which all commandments flow. Thomas writes beautifully that the old law foreshadowed the grace that the new law freely gives. You know, the entire history of Israel is, in this reading, a preparation of the human heart for the gift of the Holy Spirit. I'd like us to sit for a moment with a prayer that captures exactly this spirit, Psalm 119, which David composes in mediation for God. Now, I'm not going to read... yes, I'm going to read this. There is a writing in this that kind of gets in 119, but only partial. It says, I will observe your statutes, so forsake me not utterly. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you. Let me not wander from your commandments. I have laid up your word in my heart, that I might not sin against you. I will meditate on your precepts and fix my eyes on your ways. I will delight in your statutes. I will not forget your word. In understanding this prayer is that all of a sudden the statutes of God, the commandments, don't have an emptiness to them. That we just simply, on a formulaic method, follow through with the work of God. Let's see here if I can get these up. We then fall in love with God, and then we, is that phone ringing? Answer it real quick, and then you listen carefully and then push 5. You have to have the numbers in front of you, though. You have to have the dial pad in front of you. There you go. Okay. Thomas, let's see. Every person in this room wrong one. The fifth and final law is what Thomas called the law of foams. That's Latin. It just simply means an inclination to sin. It refers to the inherent direction we have towards sin and the inordinate desire that remains in us because of original sin. It's the impact of Adam's sin. In our original unfallen condition, Thomas says, reason governed the passions, and the will was rightly ordered to God. Now this is at their creation, Adam and Eve's creation. They were ordered to this and called to it. What is the one thing that we do today that was ordered to us before the first sin? It was work. We were called to work. It's very natural to us. That's my footnote. I just want you to know that when your kid objects to it, it's like it's the one thing that builds us, our character and everything. It's so, and that's why it's Pope Leo talks about work in his most recent, all too long encyclical. He talks about the character of work and its necessity because it pre-exists the fall. In our original unfallen condition, Thomas says, reason governed the passions, rightly ordered. When man turned his back on God, he fell under the influence of essential impulses. The more a person strays from the path of reason, Thomas says soberly, the more that person resembles a beast. We've heard that from our grandmother or mother, that we can become like a beast when we're just following our senses to that point. This is not a comfortable teaching, but it is an honest one. And no one can put it more honestly than St. Paul. In the chapter of Romans, 7th chapter, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the thing I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. So tendency towards evil. Romans 7. Every person in this room, online or in person, knows exactly what Paul is talking about. Maybe we cannot articulate it as well, or as it's confusing, but it's there. We know it. The war between what we know is right and what we find ourselves doing is a universal human experience. Thomas doesn't pretend otherwise. He names the foams precisely because the law, to be fully understood, must reckon with the actual condition of the beings it's meant to govern. This is true of all human law and even God's law, at least in nature. And precisely this is why we need all four of the other kinds of law, above all, the law of grace. Now, the effects of law. One of the things that I'll, just as a side note, argue, and Thomas doesn't directly get into, it's more of a reference, is that I would argue that physics, the law of physics, is a subsection of the natural law. One is moral, one is physical. I'll leave it at that. But that is still debated by the philosophers. We come now to the final section. What does law actually accomplish? What is it for? Thomas is refreshingly direct. He says that a law is a dictate of reason to the ruler by whom his subjects are governed, and that every law aims at being obeyed by those subject to it. The effect of law is to lead its subjects to their proper virtue. Now, I have to tell you a quick story, because when I was heading to Montana one time, or more like Canada with Bonnie, I was going 90 miles an hour down near Burley. I made the decision to go 90 because I got away with it in the past. So, and the traffic is such that at least at a given time there's not much and you can go that fast. So I come over this rise just on the other side of Burley, and there's a cop there. And he pulls me over, and he walks over to Bonnie's side, rolled down the window. He says, "Do you know how fast we're going?" "Yeah, 90 miles an hour." And so I ultimately paid it. He gave me a ticket. He didn't like my answer, but I was being honest, first of all, and secondly, what does Paul say? Be subject to the laws and those governing you. So in my response, I was being subject to him. I paid it. I moved on. So the thing is even in the attitude of disobeying the law, you still have to be subject to its enforcement, okay? I'm just being honest here. So just remember, it's always in the attitude of how we do things. We can't, it's that rebellion, of course, in the human heart that gets us in trouble. The effect of law is to lead the subjects to their proper virtue, and since virtue is what makes its subject good, the proper effect of law is to make good to those whom it is given. That's the purpose of law, to make us virtuous. Does it? Not necessarily. but it's also for the common good. What is the common good? To maintain the peace, by and large, the biggest result. And as St. Paul says, those who enforce the law are there at God's will. In Romans 13. Read it. And he goes on and says, pay your taxes. Do this, do that. Honor where honor is due. Even the emperor, as St. Paul says, and I think in Ephesians. Notice what Thomas is saying. The goal of law is not primarily compliance. It is actually human excellence. There's that word again. The law exists to make us better people, not merely to keep us from doing terrible things to each other. That too as well, but to orient us together as a community toward what is genuinely good. Where the lawmaker is fixed on evil, in other words, where the law serves the powerful rather than the common good, the effect of law is inverted. It works against divine justice rather than toward it. I would dare say it also violates natural justice as well. That is why the character and virtue of lawmakers matter enormously. It is not sufficient to have good processes. We need good people to run for the law. Now, one of the effects that we see in our society today, I'll just be honest with you, communism doesn't work. And Leo XIII in 1891 condemned socialism. He outright condemned it. Why is this? Anybody figure an answer on that? Studied that stuff? Why is socialism and in its extension communism wrong?
Just like
It's because it violates human nature. It's that simple. It says, hey, we can force people to divide what they own and make them good. It's not possible. Anyway, Thomas adds a practical element. Law also works through the fear of punishment. This is not the highest motive, but it is real and a necessary one, particularly for those who are not yet formed in virtue. The law uses fear as a tool to keep order and create conditions in that virtue can take root and grow. Now, my point about with regard to communism extent is what we see is this growing tendency in some of the major cities of the effects of law and of communism and its impact upon the common good, which is dangerous. We're heading into a dangerous field. The most recent one is a woman running for member of Congress from New York City in the likes of the current mayor, and where she made public statements that murderers should not be imprisoned at some point in her career. It's a very dangerous and anti-human position. Okay, let us bring this together in this kind of final form. Thomas Aquinas gives us a vision of law that's not merely a political or legal theory. It is a theology of order. You ever heard the term right order? This is a term that is dear to us, not only as Dominicans, but as society it's necessary. It's the conviction that reality itself is rational, real, not nonsense. And we live in the age that wants to adore and grasp with nonsense. The conviction that reality itself is rational, that God is not a tyrant, but a loving lawgiver who will is written into the nature of things and into our very hearts. We live in a time when this conviction is badly needed, when human law is increasingly untethered from the natural and the divine law, where common good gives way to faction and interest, even when the idea of objective moral truth is contested. Thomas stands as a witness to something older and deeper than any particular political arrangement that exists. The eternal law governs all creation. The natural law is written on every human heart. The divine law, given through Moses and fulfilled in Christ, directs us towards an end that no earthly politics can deliver. And the new law, the law of love, poured out by the human spirit, is the only force capable of healing the wound that what he called the law or the inclination towards sin has left in us. Aquinas did not write the Summa in an academic exercise. He wrote it as a Dominican, as a preacher of truth. And the truth he preached is this, that we are made for God, that law is the architecture of that journey, and grace is its engine. Now, one thing that has always amazed me when I read is that who was the audience of the Summa?
Students, it was in textbook effectively, so it's students.
It was students. The very early years. So the students are the one that study. It's fascinating. Anyway, that's in closing. I'm open to questions. When I gave this talk, I was gave a little rendition of the natural law and experience in the United States, and I have given examples in the papers, the Federalist Papers, and the arguments made for its passage. But the right, for example, right of life, liberty, and property, right to assemble, all these kind of have derivatives in the Catholic faith, very deep derivatives. Josh? Now it's time for questions.
Right, I have thoughts throughout a lot of this, but to start with this real quick, I wanted to note that you said through the consent of the governed. I think this is important to note the distinction here that one of the problems found very early on is a sort of divorce from God as the fundamental authority. So it became sort of more like by the consent of the governed, the voice of the people is the voice of God, sort of thing. So this is one of the big complaints that the early church, the church at that time was fighting against.
Right, 500 years ago.
Right. So you have that notion of there's no problems with the authority coming through the consent of the governed, but when you divorce that, the authority becomes
by
the consent of the governed. That's a no-go because authority comes from God.
Well, and part of that comes from the contest between the church and the Queen of England in the late 1500s, where she argued the divine right of kings. So there was this direction. So why did she make that argument? Because the Republican ideal was coming together in form, that gave form to the parliaments, and the taxing authority was coming through those, and that's why they started forming in the 1500s. And the argument was, by that divine right, she sets the tax rate, she sets the law, and you can't violate it because she is the law. She's the sovereign, and sovereign was a person, and that person could do that. Then you have, on the opposite of that, was St. Robert Bellarmine, who argued, he lived from the late, I think, 60s into 1629 or so, and he was a German Jesuit who was in Reims. Reims was the center of the church, the English church, the true English church that escaped England, went to Reims and argued there that it wasn't a divine right, it was actually law from God, and that he wrote in particular in his a book called On Government, on Civil Government. He wrote that the consent of he used that term, consent of the governed. Now what he said in his footnote, which goes to what your point you made, is what did they do in Israel? God anointed a king, but what did they do after the anointing? They dragged the proposed, king out to the people and asked for their consent. And they either raised and yelled or turned away from it. So St. Robert Bellarmine makes this point. The consent of the governed is a concept that's Catholic, but it's also biblical.
Yeah, I have one other thing I wanted to...
Sure.
I have a lot of other things, but for the sake of time, I will just ask one question in particular. Back here you noted human law has three conditions by its nature. One, it must foster religion, in other words, virtue. But particularly with regard to religion, you find a lot in Greek and Conciliar popes, particularly Immortale Dei, Leo XIII, of the notion of the state having a duty in this particular area. There's also a difference. There seems to be a tricky line between the notion of the duty of the state to promote the virtue of religion in the people and the sort of avoidance of the notion of that the state has no actual authority with regards to religion, but it does have a duty to promote the virtue of religion. And then you have the fact that the state cannot coerce in the area of religion.
Well,
so where does one put the line between promoting the virtue of religion and coercion of the state in regards to religion?
You've probably asked one of the questions. It is the most controversial questions within the church today, among the traditionalists and those who have either accepted the reality of the modern state or not. I'm one of the ones that, now how I would argue that is that the state suffers under, in the modern sense, the modern state, and I'm talking since the 1500s, I'm not talking about 2026, I'm talking about the modern state since the late 1500s, is one that has, it's broken away from the mores of the church and the guidance there, and has set up kind of it's a liberalism. I'm not talking about modernism. I'm talking about classical liberalism that's separated from the church. And part of the answer to that question was what they saw over 300 years were religious wars in which thousands, hundreds of thousands of innocent people got killed. Read about the Vendée in eastern or western France. It's just an example. Or even the Huguenots on the Protestant side of that argument, where that just people died. And people were tired of that. I am tired reading about it. It's exhausting that the religious wars, and like all war, and this was a very long one, fought both in all of Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, changed people's attitudes with regard to the role of the state. Now, this is my answer to your question, because I'm still debating inside me. But right now, what I'm saying is that there had to be a separation at some point to get away from the tyranny of those who would run the state to kill their opposing religion. It was mostly Protestant, but at some point, and what a natural result, I mean, it is as natural as A, B, C, that the United States would be formed and separate those key essentials, so that the virtue of religion was embodied. The original reading of the Constitution would be such, to be fair, was the state shall not. It's not the church shall not. The state shall not form an establishment of religion. It was a bar, it was a wall around the state. And it had a purpose, and it was an answer to this issue that had occurred over human history.
With that being said, at the time of the founding, most states had established religions.
Correct. But
no,
this was
not for the federal government. Not
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was a reality of their politics.
Yeah.
But in the Constitutional, they made that argument it couldn't be at the federal level.
I would like to just note,
Yeah.
if you have an example in a way in which a state, a modern state, could still promote the virtue of religion and not coerce.
Well, those are all over the place. One would be to what they do already, okay, the things they do right now, is when the Internal Revenue Service, when you apply for nonprofit status, they don't grant it to you, they recognize it. Why? The whole response behind that is when you get an award letter from IRS about the status of your nonprofit corporation being not tax exempt, it says you are recognized as a tax exempt. Why did they use that term? It's not somebody's bureaucratic response. It's the thinking behind the freedom of association. We just happen for tax purposes to recognize, for tax purposes alone, that you are a nonprofit and you qualify for tax exempt. That's one. It's the protection of free association is at its core in the United States. It's just one example. Alana has a question.
I have my own awesome examples, but Kevin's hand has been up for a while.
Okay.
And there's a few comments, so I want to make sure
be able
we
to speak.
My question would be, how can basically government officials, in statutory law, how can they define common good if you can't make an appeal to natural law in a courtroom?
You can make an appeal to natural law in a courtroom.
Well, you can't make it during proceedings. There's no merit to it. They'll just say, well, where's the statute?
Well,
you can make it in opening or closing remarks, but,
well, I would.
a judge isn't gonna.
Oh yeah,
isn't
no,
gonna acknowledge it.
I disagree. I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but I would make 3 points. The first thing is that the legislature does not legislate the law against murder. It recognizes the natural state against murder or stealing. So there are laws that are in the statutes in which the law-giving authority recognizes, it doesn't establish. Okay, one. Two is that, I forgot the third one, but the second one is the common law. The common law is, at times in its points, the natural law codified by prior courts. And it's also more than that, but that's part of it. The natural law, the law against murder at one point was common law based and was recognized. And the courts early on in the English experience would quote the commandment, a commandment or commandments, as a basis for the common law. The third point is habits of people, which can be, when based upon virtue, be recognized. All of business law, by way of example, all business law, even the commercial code, is grounded on behavior of businesses in right order, so that they do things justly. And those things were all grounded on English common law, which were grounded on the virtuous law, which is the law of nature. That's my opinion.
So who's after the cabin there and the?
My thought,
I'm
to think about your question, my thought was the military provides different chaplains to its military people to help promote and support their access to the First Amendment, to their right to worship. So I think that would, and they don't form them in their faith. They form them in military observance, but they don't form, like, priests still have to go through regular formation.
one of the things that I want to comment.
So I guess if that's a way.
Yeah, that is one way. I would note that I don't particularly like the wording of the
With regard to
right of religion and that.
Well, right, you know what I mean.
But you are promoting, but it allows for the space by setting up a space so that they can.
Right, and also paying the salaries of people who would provide that.
Yeah.
The right to.
With regard to promotion of religion, I think you can see the connection between freedom of association and the Catholic social teaching of subsidiarity. Things can spring up from small groups without the interference, or said differently, freedom of association. So it doesn't require the government to go out and start a religion or pay people to do it. People will naturally do that because things start from the bottom.
So they can in effect promote it by allowing the space for it to flourish.
To allow people to flourish in freedom. You know, the concept of freedom of religion and the traditional historical understanding of religion and its functional society conflict.
Start a religion.
They conflict, at least apparently. And there are those who argue that the freedom of religion, as stated in, I forget the document from Vatican II, excuse me for a sec, but it said the right of religious freedom contradicts with an 1863 encyclical by Pius, I think that was the ninth, which he said the freedom of religion is actually, in one of his syllabus of error, says it's contrary to nature. And do they really conflict? And Father Milady, God rest his soul, argued that it didn't conflict.
It doesn't.
That's what he argued.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I would agree with that. I would just note that it doesn't, depending on how you understand the terminology in some sense, because there's a difference between saying you have a moral right to false worship and saying that you have a right to seek out and worship your God.
What is the?
Because
what is
there's
this?
only one.
I know,
faith.
but what is the? That's true, but what is the core distinction of government, nature of government, than any other organization? Coercion. Everybody has the power of coercion, but the government has it has the legal right to impose its will. It has, let me repeat that again. It has the legal right to impose its will. Does Joe have the right to impose its will on his neighbor? No. Does your Rotary Club have the right to impose its will by force of? No. Does make sure you show up to the next meeting? I know I went through that. Not through force, but the point is that often have meetings I didn't want to go to. Not even here, we do not have the force. The government has the ability. So when we permit the state to, through its lens, require people to believe such and such, then they're using the force of arms to impose its will. And I would argue at its core, and this is something I'm still studying, because I'm still fighting. I want to say that I'm an old-fashioned Catholic, but in this reality is that force of law becomes powerfully immoral. When I use, as the king, say, Mike, you're going to become a Nazarene. No matter, you have no choice. I'm a Nazarene, all of you in the room are Nazarenes. Tomorrow afternoon, my edict. And I'm going to force you. And that's what they were doing in the modern era, pre-modern, is forcing people from late 1500s through the time about the founding of our country, in the early part of the 1800s, is going like this. You shall believe this way. Now, how do we answer that?
It still exists within the Islamic countries,
That's fine.
though.
Which still, it's just as immoral as hell as it was back then.
So then.
And that's what, of course, makes
so
them
then
canards.
I kind of struggle with this. So
As we should.
Alana wants to be a Nazarene, and Peter wants to be a Baptist, and I want to be a Satanist. Are we all on equal footing? Under the law?
Of course, now, under the law of the United States, yes. But
So we all say we should have an army chaplain. That means there should be a Nazarene chaplain, a Baptist chaplain, and a Satanist chaplain.
This
No.
was just in the news. I don't know if you guys.
oh, but the Mormon thing.
There's a difference between you having a moral power to do a thing and the state having an authority to come in and tell you to do a thing or not to do a thing.
Well,
You don't have the right for the military to serve you with a Nazarene chaplain.
Okay. They don't have rights.
The chaplain more or less just provides spiritual care without regard to the
But I mean,
specific
because
tradition.
various state capitol buildings have been dedicated to Satan by the virtue of this very argument that all these
yeah.
Well,
Satanists are
but the
equal footing
courts-
the Nazarenes and the Baptists, and that's how they interpret the current constitutional law.
Well,
But that's
not across the board, and plus there are many courts, much precedent, that says Satan has no right in our institutions. That has been, and that's not just historical. That's not 100 years ago. That's as recent as within the last 10 years.
Did they have something happen in Florida with that?
Yeah, something
Yeah,
like
I
that.
was just trying to look it up.
So
Like, like in the schools, and like that's not a real religion.
well, it's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like
yeah.
this. They talked this young man in the 80s to sue his parents for wrongful life. Well,
Wrongful
what
life.
does that mean? It's because he was disabled and he thought he could get, and they didn't kill him in the womb.
Right. All
So
rights that should been
I have the
taken.
right to have been killed. And so the judge, it was in New Jersey, of all places, New Jersey, said, how is this possible? Wrongful life? This is nonsense. And he almost literally kicked the attorney right out of the courtroom. How dare you bring this up in this court? And went to the Supreme Court, and they threw it out there too. That was about 40 years ago. Wrongful life?
Yeah,
Josh?
I would just note that there's one particular aspect that I think sort of reflects on this, and that's St. Thomas when he's talking about disobeying a superior. You have not avoided sin. You're still sinning.
Right.
But the culpability is going to be kind of lower. That's really the difference here. So when you have
It's only a difference of degree, right?
yeah, exactly. So you're still sinning. So when you have a right, in this sort of sense, to I don't like that term. I think the whole rights language is annoying, personally. But it's the way everybody talks in the modern world, so you would have this right to follow your conscience, but in following your conscience, that doesn't just exculpate you from the fact that you are still committed.
Yeah, actually,
to
I'm not concerned about, my concern here is what ought the state to do? Must the state treat the three of us equally, or does it have some basis for saying, Mike, you're out of line?
Well, it's what it's going to do. What they're going to do is look back. What is the purpose of, let's say, for promoting chaplains in the military?
Mhm.
It has that. It has to be obvious. I mean, Matt. I mean, a man goes out into the military, and he puts his very being in the way of, in harm's way, and he knows internally, and so does the state, know that he's doing that, and he has a conscience and a soul and a being, and that I'm going to die for my country. I'm willing to die for my country. But in the process, the country better take care of me when I'm on the front lines. And what does that include? Food, water, good boots. I mean, that's always all the way back to Rome, they understood a pair of good boots. Right clothing and the right armament, and what else? An understanding of my eternal nature. And they cannot deny that reality. And there are no atheists in a foxhole. There's something going on that shares between men in a foxhole. And the reality, I heard my dad talk about this when he fought the war. The reality is these things matter. And so the chaplaincy, is not the state saying, you shall believe, and here you're ordered to believe accordingly. It's the state responding to the need of its men and women in the military for the furtherance of an overarching...
A legitimate...
No, because God can be known by natural reason, his existence.
Well, but...
Well, I'm not arguing for atheism right now, I'm arguing for Satanism.
Right, even there,
No.
the virtue of religion, it's the duty of the state to promote the virtue of religion.
Yeah.
Okay, the virtue of religion is tied to the notion of what can be known on a natural level, which
But-
includes the existence of God.
But remember, Thomas...
And you can't go, you cannot, it's not the virtue by which you give to Satan that which you owe Satan.
But remember, this is a key point. Thomas is not talking about religion in the way you define it. The virtue of religion includes to do what is right. That's what it's talking about. To do what's right.
Oh, to God.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
can't
but
actually have a religion to say.
No, you can't. But the point is that Aquinas is talking about, and you read it, about doing what's right. It's not about the dictates and the doctrine of a particular religion. It's when men and women get on the street, do what is right.
It's a natural.
And just
Yes.
in particular for this, the Satan worshiper, it's like intrinsic that you would acknowledge that God exists.
Oh, yeah.
Because why? Because Satan is the adversary, and everything is done in adversarially to God. So you couldn't make an argument that says that God doesn't exist. So I mean, I would say that really all the Satanist is doing is pointing us at them and saying these are the easiest targets in the world to convert.
Yeah.
I think the spring.
So
I think it's,
I'll bag it. It is at the 2 o'clock. But
one last.
I struggle with broadly and
Right.
religiously conceived freedom of religion is something.
Well, I know. I mean, everything has the exceptions. Don't bar the rule, though, and that's an exception. It doesn't prevent the overall rule. I want to close with 2 comments, and then we're done. Here are 2 examples of really good examples with regard to human nature being drawn on in our founding documents, clearly expressed, and cannot be argued. Secondly, I did a study, and it was attached to today's agenda, and I sent it out to all the chapters in the Western Province, including ours. Hopefully all of you got it, but it was with regard to Catholic faith and the 250th anniversary of America's founding, and some of the writings and stuff. And I urge you to read Democracy in America by de Tocqueville, and I wrote a couple things. Anyway, it's for your study and about understanding. I make no apologies. I think that the concepts are all connected. Where we come from is Christian, no apologies, none whatsoever. But what's unimportant is that, unlike communism, our government is formed on human nature. It was Madison who said, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were governed men, neither external or internal controls of government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. And that was the form upon which we were formed, and the recognition that we are faulty people. The next paragraph, he says that ultimately the responsibility of how government operates correctly is the people themselves. I didn't put that in there. So we are responsible agents. We must be moral people, and ergo, that's why John Adams said, when asked what did we form, a republic, if it can stand. Why? Because we need to be a moral people. And the fact that we're causing the lack of proper behavior in our society today gets to the very heart of who we shouldn't be. We should be a moral people. And there's great evil here forming its way in our country. A very dangerous time. Anyway, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay.
Very difficult subject.
Good.